When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford. Londoners cannot escape this horrid little cliché. But that Samuel Johnson's 18th century utterance has become such a part of London's landscape, tells a story of a city that is a magnet for migrants. It is this idea of London, one of everlasting possibility, that has launched millions of migrant journeys and kept Londoners in place, even when they're tired of life itself and the grime and misery the city affords. It is a sense that if one is to make it, they can make it in London. It is the London dream. I've lived the London dream, moving from New Zealand's beautiful beaches and Auckland's endless suburbs to London in search of academic fortune and finding retail in misery. I lived here in Shepherd's Bush, in the kind of packed share house so familiar to London's migrant communities. As I travelled to my minimal wage job in the basement of a London bookstore, I remember stopping outside Shepherd's Bush station and being overwhelmed by the sheer diversity and intensity of London life. Of course, in London, nothing stays the same for long, and even the London dream cannot escape a pandemic. 10 years ago, though, I had the feeling that while life was hard, I was in the centre of it all. If I was going to make it, I would make it in London. My bookstore was full of people with bigger dreams. London, the city of nations, relies upon them. The city has always had a symbiotic relationship with migrants. Unable to organically replenish its stocks of willing and able working bodies, London is hungry for migrants to feed its economy. Since the Romans bridged the Thames some 2,000 years ago, attracting young people from across Britannica, there has been no shortage of migrants willing to be thrown into the city in search of the London dream. The invading Romans settled in what they called Londinium, and were initially tolerated by local tribes, a welcome they would not receive across the country. They bridged the Thames here, just by today's London Bridge, at the tidal limit of the river, and set about creating a settlement in what is now the City of London, which roughly retains the old walls of Londinium. The Romans established a city full of relative glamour, featuring an amphitheatre, the remains of which were discovered beneath the Guildhall Gallery in 1998, a basilica and a forum bigger than St Paul's Cathedral. It was in this forum, a market, meeting place and party central, that the Romans sold slaves, who made up 40% of the workforce of their empire. Even if slavery has all but disappeared from the city, London has never been able to escape the tension between its image as a place of wealth and glamour and the misery required to reproduce these dreams. And still, migrants come. London's population ebbed more than it flowed during the tumultuously desolate years after the fall of Londinium in the 5th century. But migrants continued to drift sporadically into the city, so that in the 13th century, London was described as overflowing with Italian, Spanish, provincials and Pontevins. The most anxious Brexiteer might have the same observation about East London today, although the Pontevins have been replaced by hipsters and Bangladeshis. For most Londoners, however, this hyper-diversity of humans thrown together into trying arrangements of their own choosing is not discombobulating, chaotic as it might be. It is simply the whirlpool of London life. This whirlpool is most visible in London's East End, especially around Spitalfields. Today, Spitalfields is the site of an overpriced vintage clothes market. In the 17th century, it was home to London's second wave of migrants, although they had none of the ambitions of their Roman predecessors. Between 40 and 50,000 Huguenots poured into Protestant England between 1677 and 1710. They came after their already precarious existence was made impossible by King Louis XIV. The Huguenots had been offered sanctuary by Charles II, suspicious as he was of the French, and eager for the skills and wealth these migrants would bring. The Huguenot community is long gone, but they left behind a garment industry that continues today in Spitalfields, although this fashion now has a rather hipster edge. There also remain physical hints of the Huguenots' existence. Houses, distinguished by large attic windows to maximize light for weavers, and street names define the Spitalfields area. So too remain Huguenot names, such as Farage, despite many of them being anglicised over time. These houses and names would not be the Huguenots' most lasting legacy. That lies with the introduction of the word refugee into the English language. Refugee originates from the French refugee, meaning those gone in search of refuge. It is just another iteration of the London dream. While today's refugees would not be afforded the opportunity to live in Spitalfields, the next generation of exiles to follow the Huguenots, European Jews, made their way specifically because of its cheapness. Jewish London was established in earnest when the city absorbed many of the 2 million Jews who fled widespread economic hardship and persecution in Eastern Europe between 1881 and 1914. Most sought the American dream, often arriving in London and moving on to Liverpool to sail across the Atlantic. Nonetheless, a sizable proportion remained, and by 1901 there are 140,000 Jews in the city, 95% of them around Wentworth Street in the Spitalfields area. London's Jewish population were part of the mass expansion of London during the Victorian era from 1837 to 1901, as a quick glance at a tourist map will show. Sure, we can find some of the old, like Westminster Abbey, built in the 11th century, And the new, such as the Coca-Cola London Eye, built in 2000. But most of London's iconic sites were either constructed or repurposed during the Victorian era. The Tower of London might have been built by William the Conqueror in 1066 to keep an eye on the City of London, but it's a restored 19th century version that draws 2.7 million tourists each year. The Palace of Westminster has its origins in the 11th century, but was rebuilt in the Gothic Revival style after the fire of 1834. Likewise, Buckingham Palace was substantially expanded and put into official use by Queen Victoria at the start of her reign. Trafalgar Square opened to the public in 1844, and construction started on Tower Bridge in 1886. The centre of all pop-up acts, the Elizabeth Tower, or Big Ben, was completed in 1859. Londoners look forward to it being completed again now. Even the British Museum, an 18th century invention, expanded significantly with the growing British Empire during the 19th century. The heart of contemporary Victorian London is the area in South Kensington known as Albertopolis. Founded by the proceeds of the 1851 Great Exhibition, the cultural institutions of Albertopolis are the defining legacy of Victorian refinement. From the Natural History Museum, the Royal Albert Hall, Imperial College, and of course the Victorian Albert Museum, Albertopolis showcases an era of ambition and advancement. It was also a time of great population growth. London's population grew from 2.6 million in 1851 to 6.5 million in 1901. Some came for the glamour of the London summer season and stayed on. Others came for the work, their choices having been made for them by the Industrial Revolution. For both, London offered the opportunity to escape provincial binds. But it wasn't all opportunity and excitement. Life expectancy for a boy born in London in the 1850s was 35. It was considerably lower in the slums. A large proportion of Londoners improvised their living on the streets. Lines for workhouses were long, and colonies of homeless children were a common sight. As much as Victorian London was an era of progress and splendour, it was also one of misery and squalor. It's a dynamic London just can't shake. And still, they came. London's population peaked in 1939. Only World War II and the Blitz brought from above by the Luftwaffe could stop London's growth. The Luftwaffe bombed London for 57 straight nights, killing some 40,000 Londoners and causing immense damage. The Blitz created a new mythology of London, the Blitz spirit, that would be reproduced through terrorist attacks, tube strikes and flurries of snow. It also destroyed much of the city, and led to a planned exodus from London. New towns were established, by governments seeking to lessen London's influence. Industry left the city. The London dream was fading fast. A different source of bodies and hopes was required. And so, Britain turned to its fast-dissolving empire and changed the cultural shape of London forever. Although long flush with migrants from across the British Isles and sporadic waves from the continent, in 1951, 95% of Londoners were British-born and were overwhelmingly white. The 1948 British Nationality Act changed everything. It created the status of citizen of the United Kingdoms and colonies, allowing free movement from the Commonwealth of Nations. This new legal status entrenched the rights of Commonwealth citizens to move to the UK. 500,000 non-white migrants did so between 1948 and 1962. Three-quarters of them settled in London, living out the London dream in the mother country. They came first from the Caribbean and then the Indian subcontinent, with generations of Indian and then Pakistani populations settling in places like Southall. Bangladeshi migrants continued the legacy of the Huguenots and the Jews by settling around Spitalfields, especially in Brick Lane. A new London and a new Britain was born. The city was transformed from the ally of the people of Britain to an ally of the world in a couple of generations. In 40 years, the number of foreign-born Londoners had risen from 5% to 20%. In 2017, it was over a third, with two-thirds of all children born in the capital having at least one foreign-born parent. They created a new London, one unrecognisable to many in the country. And still, despite these Commonwealth migrants, London's population continued to fall through the 1970s and 80s. The industrial jobs that had kept London's working class in humble conditions were drifting away. 80% of manufacturing jobs in London were lost between 1966 and 1996. Overall, London lost 30% of all jobs from 1962 to 1994. Crime rose by 46% from 1981 to 1991. City dwellers escaped to distant suburbs and the garden towns. If the first saviours of the London dream had already arrived from the Commonwealth, the next generation were young people from around Britain. London had already been reborn in this way during the 1960s, in what Time magazine called the swinging city, wherein Britain had lost an empire and lightened a pound, creating a city so cool that everyone wants to be there. There is no place else. But the 1960s were lost to the 1970s, conformity and industrial decline. It was this industrial decline that brought young people back to the city during the 1990s, fleeing the suburbs, their parents, and dropping acid in abandoned warehouses. Newsweek and Vanity Fair declared that London was cool again. London was the place where it was at, the place where there was always something to do. Artists like Tracy Emin and Damien Hirst dominated the scene. Bands came to London to make their name. Graduating from university and coming to London became something of a rite of passage, for the privileged, at least. London's renewed coolness suited the new post-industrial capitalism, where consumption and enjoyment were the thing. Companies built on London's diversity and coolness, turning subversion into new products and new markets. London's creative industries now add $42 billion to the capital's economy and account for almost 900,000 jobs. Most notably, the creation of the ironically dubbed Silicon Roundabout has attracted tech workers and investors from across Europe, drawn in by a collaborative and creative scene, which, ironically, is being chased away by the gentrifying effects of the tech industry. Post-industrial London has captured the hopes of young migrants from near and far, portraying itself as a place of excitement and opportunity. It is this fantasy that draws in some of the more than 400,000 people who move to London each year. Others move to London because it is the place to find work in their industry. Some come because it is a place to be seen or the place to accumulate capital. But that's not the end of the story. In London, splendour and squalor are never far apart. And, for many migrants, it is misery that defines the experience of London. And still, they come. Many of the most recent Londoners come from Europe, especially after the European Union expanded in 2004. Lots of these migrants entered into London's public sector, as well as adding to the diversity of London's creative scene. Or they just became bankers. But a substantial proportion of international migrants do the service work that reproduces London's economy, cleaning, protecting, delivering, serving and moving Londoners around the city. The dreams of these Londoners are just as strong as their contemporaries and predecessors. The story of London calls to the poor as strongly as it does the wealthy. The living and working conditions they endure, however, have no place in the fantasy of creative, cool, wealthy London. And still, they come. They come protected by the London dream, a fantasy that protects against the precarious realities endured by Londoners across the city. The London dream is ultimately a story of hope. Things might be tough now, but all it takes is one job, that one person, and things will get better. London, and capitalism, runs on this daring dance between hope and desire, despair and discontent. The combination of city and capitalism has long driven people to London for all the city has to offer: civility, consumption, cool, and the prospect of prosperity. This is the London dream, one at once invigorating, invasive, and exploitive. It continues to draw people to the city. But for how much longer? Every year, 340,000 people leave London for somewhere else in the UK, a trend accelerated by the pandemic. 6 of the 10 most miserable places in the UK are in London. Homelessness is skyrocketing, and precarious work is becoming increasingly prevalent. And let's not forget about the rent. And still, they come. Hi, I'm Chris McMillan. I'm the author of The London Dream, in which I explore the perilous pull of the city through interviews with academics to cleaners, cafe workers to filmmakers. You can find out more at chrismcmillan.me or go to your local bookstore and get it now.